Hi, and welcome to this short video podcast for Concepts and Methods Week 4 People's History. The purpose of this podcast really is just to introduce you and to elaborate upon one of the key concepts in the subject of people's history that I probably won't have time to talk about in the lecture. And I wanted really to talk a little bit about some of the problems with doing people's history, but also some of the benefits from it. And some of the ways in which it reveals different types of sources. So, what we've got really is, if we think of this board as the whole of history, this is the writing of history, and arguably there is a line that runs through that telling of history, and some people, such as kings and queens and prime ministers and famous people, they spend most of their time above that line. So they live their lives in the historical record. So they live their lives up here, and they're very visible. We can see them all the time in history. When historians write about them, these are the sorts of people up here, and this is the default line here. This is the line at which people appear in the historical record. And certain people live their lives above that line all the time. And then you have the mass of people, the kind of ordinary people, people like you and me. And we tend to spend most of our time living below the line. We don't often appear in the historical records. Now, we do appear in historical records. Obviously, records of birth, marriage, and death. Those are points at which we come up. Points at which we come up into the historical record, and then we're visible. We can be seen in the historical record, but this doesn't happen very often, and it tends to happen on a very bureaucratic level: births, marriages, deaths. The other issue with this is that ordinary people quite often tend to come up into the historical record for very negative reasons. So, for example, you may be just living your life, going about your daily business, and for some reason you break the law. And at that point, you might appear in some court records, you may appear in the newspapers, you might appear eventually in the records of the Old Bailey. And at that point, when you break the law, you come up into the historical record and you're visible to historians in the future looking back at the past. So you become visible to them. I mean, other negative times, obviously people who were transported, people who broke the law were transported. They appear for negative reasons, but also people who perhaps ended up in institutions, who ended up in asylums, people who were convicted of other things. But generally speaking, ordinary people are quite often perceived as appearing in the historical record only when they do something negative. So, generally speaking, we spend most of our time below the visibility level. As historians trying to study ordinary people, this can be really problematic, because how do we get down here? How do we get to see? This is everyday life. And if people are only going to be appearing every now and again, and mostly appearing in a negative context, how are we really going to understand what goes on down here? And one of the ways in which we can do this is at these points. So we are trying to study history, we're trying to study what's going on, but we can't get down below the line to actually find these people. This is their everyday lives down here. But there is this opportunity where they come up for some reason, which is, as I say, generally perceived to be negative reasons, but I would argue there are also a lot of positive times when ordinary people come up into these into the historical record. They become apparent in the historical record. One of which I'll be talking to you about in the lecture, which is when they perform an act of heroism. But equally, it could be when they take part in a political action, when they take part in some sort of protest, some sort of demonstration, when they make their voices heard for some reason in society. Those are other occasions when they come up or they pop up into the historical record. So, if we think about it, as these people come up into the historical record, it's only for a very short period of time. They become almost sort of visible just for a very small section of time when we can see them. And then time will move on, and they will disappear back down into below the level of recognition. So what we need to do is we need to find ordinary people when they come up into this point. We need to find them, spot them, and then when they go back down below the line again, we can go with them. We can follow them back down into their ordinary lives. Because once we've seen them and found them, we can start to contextualize them and we can go back down with them. And then we can continue perhaps to study them in their everyday, ordinary lives. But one of the benefits of this is that when they come up into the historical record, it may not always be for a negative reason. It may be for a positive reason as well. I think we need to recognise that. And once they're visible, we need to understand that once they've become visible, it's not just studying the visible point that's interesting. The purpose is that seeing them in the historical record allows us then to go back down below the line and contextualise them much more widely. So I hope that's given you just some indication of one of the reasons why it's really important to study people's history and to take a people's history approach to the study of the past. Thank you.